Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, Katie Brackett-Fialka, and today I'm talking with Anne Sarah Rubin, who is a professor of history and director of the Center for Digital History and Education at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Rubin was a co-author for the award-winning Valley of the Shadow project and is the author of two books, A Shattered Nation, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, and her most recent book, Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March in American Memory. Welcome, first of all.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, Dr. Rubin's here to talk to us today about something that seems to remain a little bit legendary and for some people a little bit notorious. And having grown up in the South, I can certainly say that I've heard my fair share of stories, some fact, some fiction, no doubt, about Sherman's March. So, Dr. Rubin, how would you say some of these legends or myths about Sherman's March sort of line up with the historical reality?
I think almost all myths have some basis in reality, and so I think that there's a degree to which they're all based in some kind of truth, so that certainly the dominant stories that we hear about Sherman's March, they're stories of destruction, and to some extent I think they exaggerate the degree of the destruction, insofar as the impression that you get a lot about what Sherman's March was that it cuts this 50-mile swath across the Confederate landscape. And of course, what I always tell my students is it's not a 50-mile lawnmower stripe. It's not it's a 50-mile sort of tornado path that wipes everything out in its path. It's 50 miles from the edge of one column through 4 columns of marchers, so that it's 50 miles from one side to the other. Which the analogy I like to use is that it's more like a row of stitches, so that you have a lot of spaces in between. One pervasive myth for a long time was that somehow the earth was a different color and you could see it from the air. And, that myth was so pervasive that actually a couple of geographers really dug deep in the 90s and used aerial photography and satellite imagery to say, no, actually, you can't. The line of demarcation is long gone. I think the other kinds of stories that really persist are what I call in my book salvation narratives, which are stories for explaining why a certain house was spared the devastation of Sherman's March. So things like lots and lots of Masonic emblems or secret Masonic handshakes put into use, right? That this is what saves the house, or Sherman personally saves the house, or pretty girls, right? House is saved because of current pretty girls. The house is saved because Sherman was in love with pretty girls who lived there a long time ago. Things like that. And what it seems to me is these stories might be true, they might not be true, but they exist because, of course, you need a reason to explain why so many houses were left standing, and that's where these stories come from.
Very, very interesting. So, why do you think these stories are so compelling, even within sort of the fabric of national memory even today?
Yeah, I think that Sherman's March has come to symbolize lots of other kinds of campaigns in the Civil War. So why do we talk about Sherman's March and how destructive it was? And people really outside of Virginia don't know much, say, about the Shenandoah Valley campaign or the destructiveness on the Kentucky-Missouri border. And I think that part of what makes Sherman's March so compelling is it's so big, right? It lasts for 6 months for all intents and purposes. If you start in Atlanta in November, and then, they get to Savannah in December, they spend about a month in Savannah, and then they're going up through the Carolinas. You have Joe Johnston's surrender in mid to late April, but then they actually keep going, and they actually go all the way to Washington, D.C. They stop burning things on that last stretch. But so it really is a 6-month-long process, and it's so big, and there's so much, I think, also kind of inherent drama in particularly the Georgia phase, in the March to the Sea, which is very distinct. And there's just sort of a natural arc to it that I think is part of the reason why these stories of Sherman's March sub in for other sorts of stories. I think that you can't really discount, certainly in the 20th century, the cultural importance of something like Gone with the Wind. But I think Sherman's March had a special place even before that book was written in the 1930s. So, for example, D.W. Griffith features Sherman's March in Birth of a Nation, and it's just sort of dropped in there. It doesn't really connect to any other piece of it. So that it has this power for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So, what's the most bizarre or confusing, unexpected story you've heard related to Sherman's March?
I was really fascinated by the complexities of how Sherman and Sherman's men interacted with African Americans and the ways that those stories were told or forgotten, that African Americans seem to either be always portrayed as one of two things, right? They're either the faithful slaves kind of hiding the silver, or they're the unfaithful slaves, telling Sherman's men where the silver is. But in fact, it's so much more complicated than that. And I think I use a WPA slave narrative in my book, and it's a man named Claiborne Moss, and he's from Georgia. And the story he spins out is fascinating because it kind of pulls in these strands from all other kinds of stories. So the first thing he talks about is that when Sherman's men come through, there's somebody with them who he recognizes, who's a man who'd been a peddler in Georgia before the war and has now come back as a Union soldier, and that this guy, this peddler, kind of slinks around and comes and steals extra things after Sherman's men come through. Then he talks about how a straggler came by and was asking which way the soldiers had gone, and his master, Claiborne Moss's master, slits this Union soldier's throat. Ooh. Right. And then he goes and he tells this whole other really interesting piece, which involves his uncle being taken by Union soldiers. And so it's really unclear whether he was taken willingly or whether he wanted to go with these Union soldiers. Disappears off with these Union soldiers. A couple days later, they get in some kind of skirmish. They give Moss's uncle silver and saddles and plunder, basically, and he turns around and takes it back to his original plantation where the master steals it. And so, it's this unbelievable story that it's just so complicated. And I think what it does is it gives you this kind of really small scale individual human dimension that you often lose when you think of Sherman's March, because it's so big, because so many of the metaphors surrounding it are so, it's always seen as this kind of almost this organism, like crunching its way through. And this gets you down to the really human scale of it.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure.
So if viewers are interested in learning a little bit more about this particular project or any of your other work, where could I point them?
I do have a website about Sherman's March, which tells, actually, I have one of the stories that we tell is from this slave narrative, and it's a mini documentary done by a student a few years ago. It's really beautiful. So my website is shermansmarch.org, and then my books obviously are available for purchase. They're both from University of North Carolina Press. So those would be good places to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.